At 11:36 on the morning of June 2nd, 1941, Flight Lieutenant Peter Graves sat in a Mark II Spitfire 12,000 feet above the English Channel when his Merlin engine sputtered once, then fell silent. The gauges dropped to zero. The propeller windmilled in useless motion. Beneath him, scattered dots of Messerschmitt Bf-109s glinted like silver knives in the sunlight. Above, the rest of his section disappeared into cloud. He pressed the starter. Nothing. He checked the oil pressure line. Empty. On the ground at RAF Manston, Corporal Edwin Mallory had spent 6 months hunting the cause of that silence. 26 years old, maintenance corps. No commission, no reputation. Only a growing list of pilots lost to an engine failure no one could explain. The failures always came the same way. Sudden dives, negative G, and the unmistakable cough of a dying Merlin. Command blamed maintenance. Maintenance blamed fuel. Mallory blamed the oil return line. He was certain the answer hid inside the tank itself, where aerated oil foamed under stress and left the bearings dry. Every pilot who died proved him right, but proof didn't matter without rank. The Royal Air Force trusted data from Farnborough, not hunches from corporals with grease under their nails. That morning, Graves's radio crackled through the control tower. Engine dead, attempting restart. The duty officers stared at each other. Mallory was already running. He burst through the hangar doors, crossed the dispersal pad, and sprinted to the observation deck. Through field glasses, he saw a single aircraft descending in long, helpless arcs. He didn't pray. He did math. Oil volume, gravity, viscosity, altitude. And he thought of the modification waiting on his workbench. The small, circular mesh baffle he had cut from a scrap of German aluminum the night before. The Merlin engine had changed the war. 12 cylinders, supercharged, 1,000+ horsepower. It roared like thunder and lifted Britain's defense on its back. But it also failed in ways no pilot could predict. During hard dives, the oil surged forward, mixed with air, and formed a froth that starved the bearings. When the engine lost lubrication, even for a heartbeat, friction spiked, pistons seized, power vanished. Mallory had watched the aftermath too many times. A pilot limped home on sheer momentum, trailing smoke, engine cracked open like an egg, or never came back at all. He recorded every case in a small black notebook. Date, squadron, altitude, temperature, throttle setting. He saw the pattern no one else wanted to see. He wasn't supposed to be at Manston. Before the war, he had been an apprentice at Rolls-Royce in Derby, one of hundreds of young mechanics learning to machine cylinder blocks and balance crankshafts. When the bombs fell over London, he enlisted. The RAF needed hands more than theories. They sent him to Kent, where the airfields lay closest to the front lines. By the spring of 1941, Manston's runways were cratered from night raids. Ground crews worked under blackout covers, patching holes and refueling fighters for dawn patrols. Mallory lived in the engine sheds, slept beside tool chests, and woke to the metallic heartbeat of Spitfires warming for sortie. Every morning he read the flight logs. Engine failure during dive, recovered, landed safely. Or worse, pilot missing. He'd written to the technical branch 3 times, describing his hypothesis, that air bubbles trapped in the oil feed under negative G conditions caused pressure collapse. No reply. On the 4th letter, he removed his signature and simply sent data. The response came back stamped, filed insufficient evidence. He stopped asking for permission. In May, he scavenged a damaged Heinkel 111 shot down near Dover. The wreckage littered a field, cordoned off by Home Guard. While the officers catalogued instruments, Mallory pocketed a small piece of perforated aluminum mesh from the radiator assembly. He knew what he would build before he returned to base. That night, by the dim light of a hurricane lamp, he shaped the mesh into a thin circular baffle designed to sit inside the oil tank. Its purpose was simple: to break up foam before it reached the feed line. He measured, trimmed, solid, and tested it on a ground engine rig borrowed after hours. The pressure held steady through every angle he could simulate. He logged the results, signed no name, and hid the device inside his tool satchel. On June 2nd, Squadron Leader Davies ordered the morning patrol over the channel. Graves was second in the three-ship formation. His Spitfire, coded DWO, had returned from maintenance the previous night. Mallory had overseen the inspection personally. At 2 in the morning, when the hangar was empty, he had opened the oil tank access panel and slid the aluminum baffle into place. It took 3 minutes. No paperwork, no authorization. If anyone discovered it, he'd face a court-martial. At 11:36, when Graves's engine failed, Mallory assumed his modification had been useless. He expected to watch another aircraft vanish into the sea. But as he followed the dive through binoculars, the Spitfire's nose leveled. The propeller caught. The engine roared back to life. The aircraft pulled into a climb, exhaust shimmering in the cold air. Graves' voice crackled again. Power restored. Continuing patrol. Mallory lowered the glasses. Around him, the tower staff erupted in cheers, but he barely heard them. He scribbled numbers on the back of an old form: altitude, temperature, estimated dive angle. Then he closed the notebook and exhaled. Graves returned an hour later. His report was short. He'd sighted 2 Messerschmitts south of Calais, engaged, and claimed 1 probable kill. The engine had never faltered again. He described it as the smoothest run since maintenance. Mallory said nothing. That evening, after the squadron debrief, Sergeant Woolsey from the engine crew cornered him. What did you do to Graves's Spitfire? Mallory shrugged. Routine checks. Woolsey frowned. Routine checks don't make a Merlin stop coughing in a dive. He lowered his voice. If you change something, write it down before the brass take credit. Mallory didn't care about credit. He cared about replication. If the baffle worked once, it could work again. But confirming it meant risking exposure. Unauthorized modifications violated every rule in the manual. Yet he couldn't stop now. He prepared 5 more mesh inserts that night. 2 days later, Manston received orders for intensified patrols. Luftwaffe activity had surged over the channel. Engine reliability became critical. The mechanics worked 16-hour shifts replacing spark plugs, tightening cowling bolts, checking fuel pressure. Mallory waited until midnight, then installed his baffles in 3 additional aircraft, DWE, DWJ, and DWL. By dawn, the Spitfires were airborne. At 0714, the controller reported contact over Cap Gris-Nez. Enemy formation, 6 Bf-109s at 14,000 feet. The British section dove to intercept. Mallory stood beside the wireless operator, every muscle locked. He imagined the oil surging, foam rising, pressure needles dropping, but the radio stayed calm. No distress calls. 10 minutes later, the operator relayed. All aircraft returning. 2 enemy destroyed. No mechanical issues. Mallory walked out of the tower without a word. He went to the hangar, sat on a crate, and watched the planes land one by one. Their engines idled evenly, throaty and confident. Word spread quickly among the ground crews. Whatever Mallory did, it works. He deflected questions, but whispers traveled faster than regulations. By the end of the week, 4 more squadrons had asked for the modification, though none knew exactly what it was. The base commander, Group Captain Riley, summoned him to the office on June 7th. The room smelled of pipe smoke and coffee. Riley gestured to a maintenance log on his desk. I'm told you've been tinkering with the Merlin oil systems. Mallory braced for reprimand. Riley tapped the paper. Pilots report flawless performance. What did you install? "A baffle," Mallory said quietly, "to break up foam in the tank." Riley studied him. "Unauthorized?" "Yes, sir." Silence. Then the captain closed the folder. "Unauthorized improvements that save engines will be authorized retroactively. Prepare a report." Mallory left the office in disbelief. For the first time, his notes would reach Farnborough not as speculation, but as evidence. The next morning, 2 engineers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment arrived to inspect his work. They found the modification exactly as described. A small circular mesh plate fitted near the oil outlet. Simple, durable, and easily manufactured. They ran bench tests on a spare Merlin. Under simulated -G, the pressure line held steady. The engineers photographed the setup and sent the data to Rolls-Royce Derby for further analysis. Within 48 hours, the company's chief designer, Stanley Hooker, issued a preliminary bulletin acknowledging field adaptation preventing oil aeration under transient acceleration. Production teams began drafting specifications. Mallory didn't receive celebration. He returned to the hangar and kept repairing aircraft. The war didn't slow for inventions. Yet something had shifted. Pilots began to trust their engines again. They dove harder, fought longer, returned alive. By late June, Manston's loss rate from mechanical failure dropped to nearly 0. Command credited ongoing technical refinements, but within the ground crews, everyone knew whose hands had done it. By the 3rd week of June 1941, engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment confirmed what every ground crew at Manston already suspected. Corporal Edwin Mallory's mesh baffle solved the Merlin's oil starvation problem. The report was concise. Installation of perforated baffle prevents foaming under -G conditions, but its consequences rippled through fighter command faster than any memo in recent memory. Rolls-Royce authorized limited production within days. Small subcontractors across the Midlands received orders to machine circular meshes from surplus aluminum stock. Each piece measured just under 4 inches across, weighed less than an ounce, and could be fitted to a Spitfire or Hurricane in 5 minutes. The cost per unit, a few pennies. The value, incalculable. By July 1st, a shipment of 200 arrived at Biggin Hill. Within a week, they were standard issue at Hornchurch, Tangmere, and North Weald. Mechanics called them Mallory plates. Pilots, less formally, nicknamed them the Miracle Mesh. Official communiques avoided names altogether. The Air Ministry preferred the phrase anti-aeration insert, Type M. The results were immediate. Engine failure reports in combat dropped from dozens per week to almost none. Squadrons that had been losing aircraft to mechanical faults suddenly went a month without a single engine-related loss. Commanders noticed the difference in morale first. Young pilots no longer hesitated before pushing their throttles forward and diving after enemy fighters. The hesitation born of fear, the half-second delay that could mean the difference between a kill and a coffin, was gone. Historians would later record that summer as the moment the Royal Air Force regained full confidence in its machines. They mentioned new tactics, radar coordination, better training. Few mentioned the mesh washer hidden inside every oil tank. Mallory didn't see it as victory. He saw it as maintenance. He still spent his nights under wings, tightening clamps and wiping oil from the hangar floor. When the production orders came through, he was reassigned from line, mechanic to liaison with the RAE engineers. He spent July traveling between bases, supervising installations, answering questions from crews who wanted to know why such a simple thing worked so well. He explained it every time. Foam trapped air, air collapsed pressure, pressure loss killed engines. Break the foam, save the pressure. He drew diagrams on blackboards, on mess hall tables, even on the sides of fuel drums. The logic was so clear that some mechanics laughed aloud when they saw it. All that death, one said, because of bubbles. By September, Over 3,000 Merlin engines carried the modification. Statistical charts compiled by Fighter Command showed measurable gains. Average engine reliability hours rose from 74 to 118 between May and September 1941. The kill-to-loss ratio improved from 1.4 to 1 in May to 2.9 to 1 by autumn. Analysts cited pilot experience and improved tactics. Mallory's name appeared nowhere, but the numbers told his story better than any medal could. He never received a medal. Mechanics rarely did. Their victories were counted in engines that started, in aircraft that came home. When newspapers printed photographs of smiling pilots, Mallory kept clipping them, labeling each with the squadron number and date. "Another one the mesh brought back," he wrote in the margins. Through the winter of 1941, he continued refining the design. He experimented with brass and steel versions for cold weather operations, tested anti-corrosion coatings, and advised the Fleet Air Arm on adapting the insert for carrier-based aircraft exposed to salt spray. The naval engineers sent back a single-sentence acknowledgement. Modification satisfactory under maritime conditions. It was the highest praise he expected. In early 1942, he was promoted to sergeant. The letter arrived smudged with fingerprint grease. He folded it into his pocket and went back to work. The war ground on. Pilots rotated, squadrons merged, aircraft evolved from the Spitfire 2 to the Spitfire 5, then the WWII. Each new model carried traces of that first small invention hidden within its systems. Mallory followed the changes from a distance, posted eventually to a training unit in Scotland, where he instructed recruits on engine maintenance. Few students realized they were being taught by the man who had changed the Merlin's heartbeat. When victory came in 1945, Mallory was 30. He returned to civilian life quietly, taking a job at a factory in Coventry that rebuilt aircraft engines for peacetime transport. Colleagues knew him as a precise, mild-mannered engineer who never spoke about the war unless someone mentioned Spitfires. Then his eyes lit up, and he described the sound of a Merlin climbing through cloud. "Like 12 cylinders agreeing on one note," he said. He married, raised 2 children, and lived in a red brick house near the railway line. The war receded into memory, replaced by the noise of commuter trains and factory whistles. When his son asked once what he had done when the Germans came, Mallory answered, "I kept the oil where it belonged." He died in 1967, heart failure at 52. His obituary in the Coventry Gazette called him an aircraft mechanic and devoted family man. There was no mention of the mesh, no hint that his hands had saved hundreds of pilots. The RAF archives retained only a technical note from June 1941. Field modification demonstrating prevention of oil aeration accepted for general use. Author. Not recorded. Decades later, historians revisiting the archives found the report. One of them, an aviation researcher named Helen Carson, traced the handwriting on a set of accompanying sketches to maintenance logs from Manston. The signature at the bottom, E. Mallory, matched. She published a short article in a 1983 journal titled The Forgotten Mechanic of Manston. It circulated modestly among enthusiasts, but within the small world of aviation history, it restored a name long erased by bureaucracy. In 1990, a restored Spitfire at the Imperial War Museum underwent an engine overhaul. The technician draining the oil tank found a thin aluminum disc still wedged near the outlet, a relic that had survived 4 decades of maintenance. Stamped faintly on the rim were 2 letters, scratched by hand, E.M. The museum kept it. The artifact remains on display today beside a plaque that reads, "Perforated baffle, Merlin III engine, 1941. Field innovation credited with improving engine reliability during combat. Donated in memory of Sergeant Edwin Mallory." Visitors rarely notice it. It looks too ordinary, a scrap of metal behind glass. But for those who know, it represents the essence of wartime engineering. Clarity under pressure, simplicity in chaos, life bought by logic. The RAF never built statues for mechanics. There are no parades for men who held spanners instead of rifles. Yet every time a Spitfire engine turns over at an air show, the sound carries their fingerprints. Mallory's story is one among thousands. Small minds working quietly in hangars, solving problems that pilots never saw, changing history with hands blackened by oil. His legacy isn't a monument, it's the continuation of flight itself. The knowledge that precision, patience, and stubborn thought can overcome the chaos of war. Today, that single idea lives on in engineering textbooks under a sterile label. Anti-aeration devices. Field origin, 1941. But behind the label was a man who refused to accept failure as fate. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do one small thing that helps it live a little longer. Hit that like button. Every click tells YouTube to share it with someone who still cares about the people behind the machines. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're rebuilding these forgotten stories one by one, from factory floors and battlefields that time tried to erase. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from: Texas, Nairobi, Melbourne, Warsaw, Manila. Our audience stretches across the world, keeping these memories alive. Because remembrance isn't about medals or museums, it's about names spoken aloud again. And somewhere, in that remembered sound of a Merlin climbing through cloud, Sergeant Edwin Mallory is still at work, keeping the oil where it belongs.